Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I am a fellow here with the Institute for Faith and Freedom, if I haven't already met you yet. And we're proud tonight to start a new lecture series to engage with the Grove City community. And we hope to do this by bringing in various professors from the college to talk about the areas of expertise. So tonight we have Dr. Shawn Ritenour, who will be talking about the topic of inflation. Dr. Ritenour is an economics professor and an expert in economics, specifically Austrian economics, and we're happy to have him here to share his thoughts on the issue of inflation tonight and how it's affecting our communities. So please welcome Dr. Shawn Ritenour.
Well, thank you very much. Very thankful to the Institute for Faith and Freedom for giving me this opportunity to shed some light on the very important topic of inflation. And as I titled the talk, Making Sense of Inflation, because there's a lot of confusion out there, and if it was just sort of academic game playing, it wouldn't be a big deal, but the confusion leads to often discussions about policy that are in error and allows us to develop then errant policies. Inflation is something that affects us every day. It affects every last one of us, whether we know it or not. And most of us do, of course, know it, and we know it good and hard. My intention tonight is to examine both the nature and the consequences of inflation. At the outset, it is important to note that inflation, what we typically consider inflation, is the culmination of a complex process. And if we do not understand how we got to where we are today, we run the risk of electing politicians who will enact policy and appoint central bankers, which will make things even worse. Much confusion about inflation exists because of ambiguity concerning its definition. During the 20th century, governments, journalists, academics, even economists, and the public began defining inflation as a process of continuously rising prices. Before that, however, inflation was commonly understood as an increase in the quantity of money held by the public. Now, the switch in focus from an increase in the quantity of money to an increase in level of overall prices is monumental because it can distract us into focusing on a symptom, which is rising prices, rather than on the root cause, which is increases in the quantity of money. It also enables policymakers to act as if the cause of higher prices is a mystery. Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia President Patrick Harker said this in an address last Thursday, quote, "In this case," meaning the case of inflation, "there is no singular cause. It has instead been a confluence of events, essentially a perfect storm, a global pandemic, a war in Europe, and yes, fiscal and monetary policy decisions have combined to limit the supply and boost demand. The result has been inflation running at 40-year highs," end of quote. Now, President Biden himself often uses the phrase Putin price hike while blaming Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. He has also blamed the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I submit to you that this is at best a confusion, and at worst, it is smoke and mirrors designed to distract us from the true nature of the problem. For our purposes, I think it is helpful to operate with two different terms: monetary inflation on the one hand and price inflation on the other. It is monetary inflation that causes the price inflation that we see all around us at the present time. Another term we may need to rehabilitate is stagflation, a term popularized in the 1970s. Stagflation, as the name implies, is a situation in which we experience both economic stagnation and price inflation. We get higher prices and recession, usually accompanied by higher unemployment. We will further discuss stagflation a little bit later. Before that, however, we need to consider the process of inflation and how it impacts our economic well-being. Perhaps the most obvious consequence of monetary inflation is that it decreases our money's purchasing power. The purchasing power of money is whatever can be bought with a monetary unit, in our case, the dollar. If the price of a postcard is 50 cents, then a dollar could purchase 2 postcards. If the price of a laptop computer is $700, then a dollar could effectively buy 1/700th of a laptop. If the price of a used car is $6,000, then a dollar could purchase effectively 1/6000th of a car. Note that because all goods in the economy are traded for money, the purchasing power of money is not determined merely by the price of one good, but by a large set of prices for a multitude of goods. Now, suppose that the prices of all goods double, so that postcards now cost $1, or the laptop computer now costs $1,400, or a car costs $12,000. It is apparent that the purchasing power of money would be cut in half. $1 could now buy only one postcard when it used to buy two. It could now buy 1/1400th of a laptop when before it could buy 1/700th. It could now buy only 1/12,000th of a car when before it could buy 1/6000th of a car. You get the picture. In other words, there's an inverse relationship between the level of overall prices and the purchasing power of money. When prices increase, the purchasing power of money decreases. Now, with that background, we are now able to examine the relationship between monetary inflation, higher overall prices, and the purchasing power of money. Now, good economics teaches that price inflation is a symptom of monetary inflation. For there to be a general increase in overall prices, there must be an increased demand relative to the supply of goods in general. If there is merely an increase in the demand for some goods, which are offset by decreases in demand for other goods, then this would not result in a general increase in prices. If the prices of food and health care increase, for example, while the prices of energy and cars decrease, we would not see this as inflation. It would merely be a reflection of the normal changes in relative demand for various economic goods that reflect people's preferences. This happens all the time. A general increase in prices, however, is a result of a general increase in the demand for goods throughout the economy. Now, this is only possible if people have more money to spend. Only if we have more money can we demand more food and health care without decreasing our demand for other goods. In other words, sustained price inflation is only possible by monetary inflation. And understanding this fact is crucially important if we want to truly understand the source of the higher prices we have to pay for goods every day. So where does this monetary inflation come from? Who is the culprit? The short answer to this question is the Federal Reserve System. Known affectionately or not so affectionately, as the case may be, the Fed. The Fed is the source of monetary inflation because it is the institution that has a government-enforced monopoly on issuing money. If you or I would use a copier in our basement and some really nice paper to print loads of money and then use them to buy things, we would get in trouble for counterfeiting. When the Fed does it, however, it's just considered monetary policy. Now, how does the Fed generate this inflation? Well, when it desires interest rates to fall, it doesn't actually print money in its basement and just start chucking it out the window. No, it acts to increase reserves at banks like FNB or Northwest Bank. It does so by buying various financial assets, such as treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, with money that it creates out of thin air. Now, this new money ends up deposited at commercial banks, increasing their reserves. And with increasing reserves, the banks are able to expand credit, lending out this new money to a variety of different people in the economy, which increases the money supply. Now, because the money supply has increased, people will be holding more money in general than they desire to hold at the prevailing level of overall prices. In other words, they experience an excess supply of money. Horrors, right? Now, this, it turns out, is an easy problem to solve. If I have too much money, I solve that problem by spending it. Right? My daughters are very good at this. Right? When that happens, people just increase their spending. Households spend more on consumer goods, increasing the demand for them. This increased demand for consumer goods drives up their prices as they are bid up by more eager buyers. Likewise, businesses spend more money on land, labor, and capital goods, so the demand for factors of production increases in their various markets as well. So increased demand for factors of production will cause their prices to increase, and in short, the level of overall prices will be higher and the purchasing power of the dollar will fall. Now note, this process of monetary inflation does not provide a general benefit to society. If everyone's cash balances increase by 30%, that looks great. But if prices also increase by 30%, no one is really any better off. Increases in the quantity of money do not spontaneously create more land, labor, and capital goods. Therefore, it does not result in more consumer goods either. It merely increases the amount of money people spend on the same quantity of goods. So overall prices increase and the purchasing power of money must decrease. However, while there is no general social benefit from inflation, we should recognize that some people do benefit at the expense of others. Newly created money does not enter the economy all at once, evenly, in everyone's bank account. The money first appears in the reserves of a small group of 24 preferred financial institutions, and they lend it out to various borrowers. So they are the early recipients of the new money. So they can increase their spending before overall prices rise. So they are the ones who benefit from inflation. Now, as the money passes from the hands of banks to businesses, to employees, to other businesses, overall prices begin to rise until, for some people, the new money they receive is just enough to offset the higher prices. Now, these people, we could say, are no better off or worse off. But there are those, however, who are certainly harmed by monetary inflation. They are those who get some of the new money so late in the process that their increase in income is not enough to offset the generally higher prices. And finally, there are some who live on fixed incomes. They do not see a dime of the new money, but must pay the higher prices all the same. And these last two groups of people are positively harmed by the process of inflation. For them, inflation is worse than useless. It destroys their real income and the value of their savings. So while there is no general social benefit from inflation, some citizens do benefit at the expense of others. Those people who benefit are those who have close connections to the banking system, and those who are harmed are the rest of us. Now, if this was one of those late-night infomercials, this is the point where I would say, but wait, there's more. This mechanism by which the new money enters the economy also, it turns out, is the root of the business cycle, which always culminates in recession and economic stagnation. As we have seen, the Federal Reserve injects liquidity into the financial system. When it does so, it expands credit, making it possible for banks to artificially lower market interest rates. Businesses acquire new money at the lower rates and their entrepreneurial ambitions expand, which results in an economic boom. New businesses are started, using the new money to buy land, labor, and capital goods. Wages increase, and happy days appear to be here again. Alas, these new projects appear profitable only because market interest rates are pushed artificially low. Unfortunately, the new structure of production does not reflect voluntary saving patterns. It only reflects new money. Investors are led, therefore, to make investments as if more real savings are available, when in fact they are not. Unless larger amounts of new money are again injected into the banking system, market interest rates will return to their original higher levels, and much of the newly begun projects will prove to be unprofitable. These investments must either be liquidated or abandoned altogether. Some businesses become bankrupt and their workers will lose their jobs. Asset values fall, stock prices tank, retirement funds shrink, banks contract credit as borrowers face financial difficulties, while firms need cash to pay off and stay financially afloat, to pay off debts and stay financially afloat. Depositors may even begin withdrawing money out of their savings accounts. All of this results in the so-called sudden outflow of cash that keeps central bankers up at night. Such an inflationary boom-bust pattern has been the recurring story since the advent of the Fed. And it is this inflationary boom-bust cycle that is the setting for stagnation, or I should say stagflation, a period of price inflation and stagnant growth. Now, having covered all that economic ground, we are in good shape to make sense of our current inflationary situation. Certainly, we are suffering price inflation like we've never experienced since the 1980s. In fact, 1980 proper. One measure of the level of prices calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is a Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It's a weighted average of the prices of a market basket of consumer goods. Now, in December of 2019, the Consumer Price Index increased at an annual rate of 2.2%. Last month, it increased at an annual rate of 8.3%. A broader measure of overall prices is the GDP price deflator, which includes the prices of all goods accounted for in gross domestic product. Now, in the second quarter of this year, the GDP price deflator rose at an annual rate of 9.1%. And that is the fast quarterly increase since 1981. It is also the fifth consecutive quarterly gain at an annual rate of 6% or more. The last time this occurred was during the high inflation years of 1980 and 1981. Now, from the beginning of 2019 to the end of 2021, the S&P 500, a well-known index of prices in the stock market, increased almost 48%. We are indeed living in historical times. Just not happy historical times. The cause of this historic increase in overall prices is massive inflation of the money supply. Former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke's commitment to quantitative easing following the 2008 financial crisis was a commitment to significantly higher rates of monetary inflation. Indeed, the money supply increased approximately 134% total from 2010 to 2019. Since then, however, things have gotten even worse. It has been Katie bar the door. The Fed increased the money supply 96% from 2019 to 2021. In other words, it almost doubled the money supply in 2 years, increasing it by $3 trillion since 2019. That's T with a trillion, or trillion with a T, I should say. That is unprecedented. We've never done this before. So again, enjoy it. We're living in historically unprecedented times. As financial historian and commentator James Grant said recently in a public address, quote, the very last thing our fallible species needs is a monetary system that leads us into temptation. Yet this is precisely the system in place. A dozen years of suppressed interest rates have misdirected money, waylaid judgments, and turned the switch-marked financial gravity to the off position, end of quote. My friend Patrick Newman, who also is a current visiting professor at Grove City College, recently gave a lecture documenting the consequence of the Fed's monetary mischief. He noted that by inflating the money supply as it has, the Fed has also sowed the seeds of economic trouble. It has severely discouraged saving, the very thing necessary for capital formation and economic progress. From 2019 to 2022, the nation's savings rate decreased from 9% to 3%. I mean, why save money when interest rates are virtually zero? Thank you, Chairman Bernanke and others. As we have already seen, increased spending on consumer goods have increased prices. The prices of factors have also been bent up 35% during this period of time. At the same time, borrowing has continued. During last year and this, bank loans have increased 13%. The U.S. government has increased their borrowing at reckless rates. Government total official debt now stands at $31 trillion, compared to $14.7 trillion in 2012. I remember we thought $14.7 trillion was a lot of money. In just the last 10 years, we have added to our debt more than we did in the entire history of our republic up to this time. Not surprisingly, real wealth has fallen. The inflation-adjusted S&P 500 index is below its highest mark before the lockdown. All the supposed gains that came after we reopened up proved to be illusory. Real wages have fallen because paychecks have not kept up with increased prices. GDP has shifted into reverse. During the last 2 quarters of 2019, GDP increased at an annual rate of 1.3%. Now, while that's nothing to write home about, in the first 2 quarters of this year, it actually declined 0.6%. It seems we have significantly higher prices, less real wealth, and a stagnant economy. It's that 70s show all over again. People can see it, and they can feel it, and they're asking why and how did we get here? Don't be fooled. Certain policies, such as increasing regulation, shutting down supply chains, and government stimulus may aggravate and affect the specific form price inflation takes, but that's all it does. The ultimate cause of overall price increases stagflation, and even hyperinflation, if it comes to that, is monetary inflation created by the central bank. It's the Fed increasing the money supply. So the only way out is to stop inflating the money supply. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act must be one of the most dishonestly titled pieces of legislation in our history. It will do nothing, and I mean nothing, to reduce overall prices because it doesn't touch the actual source of price inflation. Now more than ever, we need to stop inflating the money supply and allow entrepreneurs to make their best choices, allowing us to get back on a more solid footing. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Or not. Yes, sir.
Will the prices ever come back down again? Like, so a bag of Doritos, now it's $5. It was 2 years ago, it was $3.50. Is it ever going to get back down to $3.50? Are we stuck?
I suspect not, because the government doesn't. The government and the Fed, especially, doesn't want that to happen. Right there.
Buying a smaller bag of Doritos.
Well, sure, yeah, right. But the per unit cost will stay the same, or will not go back down, because this is actually a great sleight of hand that happened during the Bernanke period, where he became literally like a deflation phobe. He became phobic of lower prices. He thought that would be disastrous. And so he changed subtly the target rate of price increase from stable prices, which would be 0%, to 2%. He thought 2% higher prices every year would be the best rate of price increase to allow us to have a smoothly functioning, prosperous economy. Well, what that means, and so what the Fed is trying to do now is not bring prices back down to where they were, say, in 2017. They just want to bring the rate of price inflation down to 2%. So they don't want prices to go down. They want prices to not go up by as much. So unless there's a significant change, I don't think prices will go back down to where they were before. The rate of increase. What they would like to do is slow the rate of increase in prices. Now, even if they do that, that will cause some economic readjustment. But I don't see that there will be. Certainly, they don't want a general decrease in prices. Now, we would get that if we would just stop inflating the money supply. Our increased productivity that we still enjoy would eventually lead to a larger increase in the quantity of goods. But the Fed seems just to be absolutely frightened and completely opposed to that. So I don't think the prices ever come. We're just going to be stuck with what they are. We're hoping maybe the wages will catch up. But yes, sir.
Well, how do we stop this? It doesn't seem to matter whether a Democrat appoints the Fed chairman or a Republican appoints the Fed chairman. All the Fed chairmen are completely independent once they're in there.
Yeah.
And they don't take their foot off the throttle.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's an excellent point. Because a lot of people, people whoever of whatever political stripe, you like to blame the other party. But the fact is, one of my students in money banking asked me this very question: that is there something that the political, that the political leadership on both sides they agree with? I said, well, central banking, because if you think who is the person that say that the Democrats hate the most, it'd probably be President Trump, former President Trump. He appointed our current Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, and then his term came up just recently, and what did President Biden do? He reappointed Jerome Powell, right? And so the one thing that the Democrats and the Republicans seem to agree on is that we need to have a central banker that's going to increase the money supply to allow for more inflation. So, yeah, and of course, the ideology within the Fed has significantly changed especially since 2008. There's an excellent book that I highly recommend called The Lords of Easy Money. And The Lords of Easy Money is written by a man whose name escapes me now, but he is sort of an investigative reporter of sorts. But he's written for a number of reputable news outlets, and he tells the story of Well, it tells a couple of different stories, but one story is the former president of the Kansas City Fed, named Thomas Honig, how often when he was on the Federal Open Market Committee, what is the committee within the Fed that determines monetary policy, he was the lone dissenting voice against the other 6 people that were members, including Chairman Bernanke, to the point where Bernanke kind of got a little bit unhappy with him because he was really into complete consensus. And Honig thought that, well, even if we wanted to say the first round of quantitative easing may have been necessary or helpful, we didn't need round 2 or 3 or quantitative easing infinity, which we're in now, basically. And interestingly, that book reveals that also at the time, Jerome Powell, when he was not yet the chairman, he also voiced, at least in the discussion, some misgivings about this. He never voted against Bernanke, but he voiced some misgivings. But at some point, he ended up drinking the Fed Kool-Aid. It's probably green. And something happened, and he sort of learned to stop worrying and love monetary inflation. And so now we are where we are. So no, I'm very pessimistic about the Fed, in some sense, changing its ways. I mean, Jerome Powell has been on record that he's wanting to rein in inflation, and I will say, over the last 3 months, the money supply actually has decreased some. So he does seem committed to doing what he has to do to bring it under control, but he thinks that the only solution is to actually raise interest rates instead of just stop inflating. So I don't know. We'll see where it goes from here. But I mean, he's committed to inflating when we need to be. I was particularly disappointed when Judy Shelton was a lady who was nominated to be a Fed board a member, and she was routinely, shouted down, and basically they said that she was, kind of crazy because she had some nice things to say about the gold standard. And that's like, almost, that's anathema to the people that are in charge now. So it would require radical change for anything positive to be done vis-a-vis the Federal Reserve. Yes?
What is their motivation? And what is their end game?
Well, that's a good question. I think part of the motivation is just to maintain power. They like the idea that they have the reins of power, and they're going to be using it for the public good. They think. I think that's part of it. I do think that even though the Fed is independent, it often does the bidding, and so the U.S. government has figured this out, right? That they borrow a lot of money. And if you and I go out and we all start to demand more loanable funds, what's going to happen to interest rates? They're going to rise. And the Fed doesn't want that to happen because if the interest rates rise too much, that could throw us into recession. People aren't going to borrow as much. Businesses will slow down hiring. Unemployment will go up. Well, the Fed, by law, is called to maintain full employment. So they don't want employment going up. And so the Fed then will inject enough money to keep interest rates lower. And so the government, they do this little two-step, right? The U.S. Treasury will go out and spend the gobs of money that they don't have. They don't have enough tax revenue. So then they have to borrow money from the banking system, which would push interest rates up, but then the Fed accommodates and increases the money supply. And so they may be independent technically, but they often do the bidding of the government. And in fact, every now and then, a Fed chairman will say this in public. Back in the 60s, Arthur Burns was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And somebody I believe it was one of the hearings, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just in a press conference. Someone asked him, said, well, look, why do you always seem to go along with what the administration wants? He says, well, we have to do what Congress wants, because if we don't do what Congress wants, we'll lose our independence. Which I think is somewhat ironic. So I think that I also think that there are, there's interesting ideologies within the Fed. The kind of what do you want to call it? The type of the same ideology that's been promoted by the World Economic Forum. You also see evidence of it in Fed statements about pushing sustainability and pushing diversity, things you wouldn't think necessarily would be something that a central bank would be overly concerned about. It's certainly not in their mandate. Their mandate is not to provide for, a sustainable future, whatever that means. It's not an environmental mandate. It's not a mandate for diversity. It's a mandate legally to keep prices stable and maintain full employment. And so I think that there is a lot of ideology that's driving the car also, I guess. Yeah.
I think if we changed how the Fed got their operating funds, they get their operating funds from nicking the banks. If we took that away from them and made them go to Congress every year, then they'd be more inclined to listen to the Congress and affect people than they are now. Because they don't care about anybody. They just do what they want.
Yeah, I think that could be one thing. I mean, you could also, the easiest thing to do, and of course nobody wants to do this, but the easiest thing to do is just by statute say that the Fed can no longer engage in open market operations. They can no longer buy treasury bonds or no longer buy mortgage-backed securities. And I think that would significantly limit what they could do. And then the economy would arrange itself around the quantity of money that exists, and we could do it. I mean, it would just be, people would do what they do in every other market. So that's one thing they could do. I mean, ideally, I mean, I personally don't see why we need a Federal Reserve. I mean, we don't have a central soda pop making machine. We don't have a central shirt producing firm that is in charge of just maintaining the right amount of shirts. No, that's called the market. The free market does this. All of the different entrepreneurs see to it that we have, the right amount of soda pop, as long as we're not stepping in and shutting down the supply chain. So we could do the same thing with money production. There's no, I don't see a need for having the idea that you have the entire economy basically controlled by 6 to 7 people in a room that meet once a month. That just doesn't. That seems a little odd to me. But those changes. I mean, those are radical changes, and I just don't think nobody's ready for that, really. Yes.
Yeah. So if we're stuck in this situation, what would you recommend individuals do?
Well, that's a good question. I would try to not take any more debt. Don't take on any additional debt if you don't have to, because you don't want to. If and I mean if we haven't really hit the bust yet. The bust comes, you figure there could be significant unemployment, significant sluggishness in the economy. When that happens, you don't want to be in a situation where your job's in jeopardy, but you have bills, you have debt to pay, right? So you want to do that. I would also I think it makes sense now. I mean, it made sense before, and I think it still makes sense now to, if there are things out there now, say items, goods that your household needs, and but they're like staples, like tuna fish or soap or what have you, I think it makes sense to buy them in bulk now. Right? I mean, because if the prices of those things, let's say, are going to be 8% higher next year, if you buy in bulk now, it's like getting 8% on your money. Than if you just wait and sort of buy them piecemeal over the course of the price inflation. So I think it makes sense to do that. It makes sense to sort of maintain durable consumer goods. Maintain your automobiles as you can, because nothing's getting any cheaper. In some sense, there's not a whole lot that you can do. But those are little things that can be done. I once was asked by a state congressman, well, what can the state of Pennsylvania do? And again, there's not a whole lot that, say, even a state government can do, because they don't set monetary policy. They can try to lower costs in general through becoming more efficient, reducing regulations, reducing government spending, allow people to keep more of their disposable income. That would all be good, but that doesn't do anything about the increase in the money supply. that just has to sort of work itself out.
Isn't there the opposite side of this market, right? So you're mentioning that money is a good itself, right?
Yeah.
Right, so there's this demand as well. So what would happen if a large portion of the economy went towards more of a bartering economy, for example, or some other monetary, right, rather than using dollars?
Well, in some sense, that's one of the downsides of a sort of a hyperinflation type of situation, which are not there yet, but that tends to happen when prices are going up so fast, that the purchasing power of the dollar is falling so quickly that, using money to buy things, it doesn't even make sense, because the money prices that are the prices today aren't going to be the same price. They're going to be close to, say, next month. So what do? So people can, you go back into sort of bartering, sort of trading for what they call the flight to real goods, and they can engage in barter. And to the extent that you can engage in barter, that's beneficial compared to not exchanging at all. But there are tremendous problems with the barter system that it greatly limits the scope for exchange, which means it greatly limits the scope for the division of labor, which means as a society will be less productive. And so it's a way to survive. It's not a way to flourish. Yes. Okay. Yes, sir.
You talked about how inflation policies from the Fed hurt those who are furthest away from the banks.
Yes.
Kind of meh for the people that are close or that are near them. What about policies that aim to directly put money into people's hands that need it, such as the stimulus checks or student loan forgiveness? How do those impact inflation?
Well, in some sense, I think that the putting money in the hands of the households is probably the thing that really sort of finally jump-started consumer price inflation, because you have all these households that are getting all this new money given directly to them, most of it paid for by monetary inflation. And so what do? They go out and they spend it on things. Now, they didn't spend it all. I mean, we should be thankful, by the way. It could be a whole lot worse. There actually was a buildup of cash balances from, say, 2019 to 2020. And so cash balances, household cash holdings did increase. If they wouldn't have increased our cash holding, we would be seeing double-digit inflation already. So what those stimulus checks do is it directed the inflation into households, which then made it more likely that more of the new money were hitting consumer goods markets first, rather than sort of investments in the financial markets the way it has been going over the last 20 years, I would think. So it sort of changed the form of the inflation, but it aggravated, in some sense, it aggravated the inflation for the average household because of that. And now, of course, we're back to where the stimulus checks have run out, but the prices are still raging.
So what's the likelihood that we could get into a situation where if we're running hyperinflation, where it's inflation in the high teens?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I'm an economist, not an entrepreneur, so I don't really know the answer to that. I think it's real, because on the one hand, the bulk of price inflation hit the financial markets, right? When the S&P 500 is going up 45% in a 2-year period, that isn't because we became 45% more productive in 2 years. That's because of monetary inflation, right?
Now the market is the consumer market is following the stock circuit.
Exactly. And if people sort of, and I should say this too, that there's been an increase in consumer borrowing. So consumer credit is starting to tick back up, because I think, given the higher prices, they're wanting to kind of maintain their lifestyle to a certain extent, and they're putting more and more of their purchasing on credit cards in the hopes that things are going to kind of normalize. Whether that happens, who knows? I don't think it's going to normalize anytime soon. But again, you can't perfectly predict the future. However, if this thing changes, and if equities start to fall a little bit, and the people start selling off, they take that cash and they start spending on other things, we could. I don't see why we couldn't get significantly higher price inflation into the teens, annual rates in the teens, because there's still a lot of new money that's out there that could be spent. I mean, a lot of it depends on how much do households and institutions want to hold on to their cash. If they want to hold on to cash, then inflation won't be so bad. It won't necessarily get a whole lot worse. But if they start spending it at any point, then things get really interesting really fast.
Don't you reach a point though where you essentially have to recalibrate your currency because a penny it's not a unit of currency anymore.
Oh.
You can't buy anything with a penny.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think back in my home, I think it's $1 trillion Zimbabwe note. I'm a trillionaire in Zimbabwe, but I can't buy anything with it because even $1 trillion it was worth nothing, right? But that's what they did. They recalibrated. The great hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, they recalibrated. I have a 10 million mark note issued by the Deutsche Bank, and so yeah, that is what could happen. And if it gets that bad, I could see it happening. But you just never can tell. You just never know how bad it's going to be. It's not going to be good.
Well, on that note.
Yeah. They don't call me the dismal scientist for nothing.
Right, I did. I was telling Dr. Ritenour he's our guinea pig for this. This is our first, I was standing back